So we've seen there are three different pronoun cases: the subjective case, the objective case, and the possessive case. Choosing the right pronoun case to use is usually not too hard, but there are a few instances in which pronoun case can be a little tricky. Let's look at those now. First, many people find it tricky to remember how to use the pronouns who and whom. I'm going to give you a simple rule which should enable you to avoid any errors in using who and whom. First of all, remember that both who and whom can be used in more than one way. Both of these can be used as interrogative pronouns as well as relative pronouns. Having said that, the same rule applies in either case. Here's the rule. Who is in the subjective case and must be used as the subject of a verb. Whom is in the objective case and must be used as the direct object of a verb or as the object of a preposition. So here's the way to apply that rule to avoid mistakes in using who or whom. Whenever you see a clause that includes who or whom, find the verb and ask who or what is the subject of this verb. The answer to that question will tell you whether who or whom should be used correctly. Let's look at a couple of examples. First, let's look at a couple of examples using who or whom in the interrogative form, that is, to introduce a question. Who or whom is your favorite athlete? Question mark. Okay, here's the pronoun being used as an interrogative pronoun. Should it be who or whom? Well, let's find the verb. The verb is. Now, what's the subject of the verb is? Is it athlete? Is the sentence saying athlete is? No, not really. The subject of the verb is the pronoun, who or whom. Therefore, since who is being used as the subject of the verb, that's the correct form. The subjective form, who, would be correct, not the objective form, whom. What about this sentence? Who or whom did you invite to the party? Once again, who or whom is being used as an interrogative pronoun. Now, what's the verb in this clause? The verb is invite. And who or what is the subject of invite? That is, who is doing the inviting? Well, the answer is you. You are the one doing the inviting. Therefore, who or whom can't be used as the subject of the verb. Instead, it's the object of the verb. It's the one being invited. It's the one receiving the action of the invitation. You is the subject of the verb invite, and the object of the verb is who or whom. Since the pronoun is the object of the verb, whom is correct rather than who. So in both of these sentences where the who or whom pronoun is being used as an interrogative pronoun, once you find the verb and ask who or what is the subject, it's not too hard to see that in one case the pronoun is in the subjective case and in the other in the objective case. Now let's look at a couple of sentences in which who or whom is being used as a relative pronoun. In other words, to introduce a subordinate clause. Here's the first one. She is the one who or whom painted that picture. Now here, who or whom is being used as a relative pronoun to introduce the subordinate clause, who or whom painted that picture. In order to determine which pronoun is correct, again, look for the verb and then ask who or what is the subject of that verb. Now the verb in the subordinate clause is painted. Who or what did the painting? Well, who or whom would be the subject of the verb painted. That's the one that's doing the painting. Since the pronoun is being used as the subject of the verb painted, it should be in the subjective case, who. So who would be correct. She is the one who painted that picture. Here's a different example. She is the one who or whom I love. Once again, who or whom is being used as a relative pronoun to introduce a subordinate clause, who I love or whom I love. Now, which is correct? Is it who or whom? Well, let's look at the subordinate clause, find the verb, and then ask who or what is the subject of that verb. The verb is love. Who or what is doing the loving? I am. I am the subject. So who or whom is not the subject of the verb. Instead, it's the object of the verb. Who or whom is the one that I love. Who or whom, then, is receiving the action of the verb and therefore should be in the objective case. So whom would be correct in this sentence. She is the one whom I love. So when who or whom appears in a sentence, whether it's an interrogative pronoun or a relative pronoun, just look at the clause in which who or whom appears, find the verb, and then ask who or what is the subject of the verb. If the subject is who or whom, use who. If the subject is not who or whom, use whom. That's the rule. A second situation in which choosing the correct pronoun case can be tricky involves elliptical clauses beginning with than or as. Okay, what does all this mean? Well, an elliptical clause is a clause from which a few words have been omitted, since the clause is understandable without those words. Now, when a pronoun is used in this kind of clause, what you need to do is complete the clause. That is, fill in the entire meaning of the clause. Add back in the words that have been omitted. Usually when you do this, you can then tell whether the pronoun is the subject of a verb or the object of a verb. If it's the subject of the verb, then of course it should be in the subjective case. If it's the object of the verb, it should be in the objective case. But in order to determine this, you need to add back in the words that have been omitted from the elliptical clause. Okay, are you confused? Let's look at some examples, and this will help make it a little bit clearer. Eduardo is a better dancer than I or me. Okay, we have the word than, which is one of the telltale signs that we're dealing with an elliptical clause, a clause from which some words have been omitted. Remember, these will begin with than or as. Now, in this case, if we were to fill in the missing words or the missing ideas, what would those last few words of the sentence say? Right now, the elliptical clause reads than I, and there's no verb there. If we were to fill in the missing verb which has been omitted, what would it say? Well, it would probably have to say the following: Eduardo is a better dancer than I am. Notice that the verb am has simply been omitted because you can tell what the sentence says without it. And in using language, people tend to cut out unnecessary words. So in this case, the elliptical clause means that the verb am has been omitted. Once we plug the verb am back in, we can see that the pronoun I or me is the subject of that verb, and therefore I is the correct pronoun to use. It would not be correct to say Eduardo is a better dancer than me, because if you were to say that, it would be as if you were saying that the elliptical clause should read Eduardo is a better dancer than me am. And that's clearly not correct. Instead, the subjective case of the pronoun I should be used even when the verb am is omitted. So the sentence should correctly read, Eduardo is a better dancer than I. Take a look at this example. My dog barks at my sister as much as I or me. Okay, once again we have an elliptical clause at the end of the sentence from which some words have been omitted. And in this case, it begins with as. That's the other word that often begins an elliptical clause. Now, what is being said here? Is the sentence saying, my dog barks at my sister as much as I do? No, I don't think so, because most human beings don't bark. Instead, I think what the sentence is saying, if you fill in the missing words, is, my dog barks at my sister as much as he barks at me. Okay, assuming that that's the correct meaning, which seems logical in the context of what we know about dogs and human beings. So if that's what's being said, then the correct pronoun should be me, because you use the objective case pronoun based on the fact that once the omitted words have been stuck back in, we see that the pronoun is the object of the verb barks. So once the omitted words are stuck back in, the sentence would read, my dog barks at my sister as much as he barks at me. Therefore, once we omit the words again and turn it back into an elliptical clause, me should be used. My dog barks at my sister as much as me. One more example. Elaine danced with him more than I or me. Here, the sentence is somewhat ambiguous, probably me is the correct choice if we assume, for example, that a man is speaking and that men and women tend to dance together. Because under that interpretation, the sentence would mean, Elaine danced with him more than she danced with me. And since me, the object form of the pronoun, would be correct, then me would be correct once those words have been omitted. On the other hand, for example, if a woman were speaking, or for that matter, if a man were speaking and men could dance with one another, then it might be possible that the sentence is trying to say, Elaine danced with him more than I did, in which case the pronoun I would be correct. So you see, in this particular sentence, choosing the correct pronoun, I or me, makes a difference as to what the sentence says. And therefore, you have to think through what you're trying to say, fill out the elliptical clause, add back in the omitted words, discover which pronoun would be correct with those omitted words, and that will tell you what the pronoun should be in the elliptical clause. Sound a little tricky? A bit, but once you get used to the idea of filling back in the missing words, it's not too hard to see what is the correct pronoun to use in this kind of elliptical clause. The third and final tricky pronoun case problem that we'll talk about is really the simplest of the three. When a pronoun is used in a compound subject or a compound object, use the same case as if the subject or object were not compound. As you recall, the subject of a verb or the object of a verb may sometimes be compound. In other words, there may be two or more subjects or objects joined together with a word like and. When this is the case, it shouldn't affect the case of the pronoun. So here's a tip. When you've got a compound subject or a compound object and you're not sure what pronoun to use, break the sentence into two sentences with two separate subjects or objects. And that will tell you whether the pronoun should be in the subjective case or the objective case. Or at least it will make it much easier to tell. Here's an example. She or her and Raphael spent the winter holiday in Sao Paulo. Here we have a compound subject of the sentence. There are two people who spent the winter holiday in Sao Paulo. She or her is one of the subjects. Raphael is the other. Since we have a compound subject, the pronoun should be in the subjective case. Therefore, she would be correct. However, if this isn't obvious, break it into two sentences and then it becomes obvious. One sentence would be, Raphael spent the winter holiday in Sao Paulo. The other would be, she spent the winter holiday in Sao Paulo. Once you separate out the two subjects, then it becomes very obvious that the subjective case is correct and she would be used rather than her. One more example. Raphael's father threw a party for Lana and he or him. Once again, if you're not sure which is correct, break the sentence into two, and then it'll be fairly obvious whether we're dealing with a subject or an object. Raphael's father threw a party for Lana. Raphael's father threw a party for him. This is the object of the preposition for. It is a compound object, Lana and him. When you break it into two, and it becomes clear that him is the object of the preposition and therefore should be in the objective case. Him is correct rather than he. So whenever you have a pronoun that is linked to another word in a sentence and you're not sure whether there should be a subjective case pronoun or an objective case pronoun, break the sentence into two sentences and then see what the pronoun ought to be. And it would be the same once the sentence is compounded back again. Try your hand at the exercise in the study guide, which gives you a chance to test your understanding of these rules related to tricky instances of pronoun case agreement. After you've tried the exercise, come back and we'll look at those sentences together. In the sentences in this exercise, some pronouns have been omitted. Your job is to figure out which is the correct pronoun to insert from the choices that we've offered. And I think you'll find that the rules that we discussed in this lesson should enable you to do that in each case. Let's look at the first example. No one in my town knows as much about local history as I or me. Here we have an elliptical clause beginning with as at the end of the sentence. And in order to figure out whether the correct pronoun is the subjective case, I, or the objective case, me, we need to fill in the missing word. What is the sentence really saying if we were to add in any missing word or words? Well, I think what the sentence is saying is, no one in my town knows as much about local history as I do. Therefore, once we insert the missing word, we can see that the verb do has as its subject the pronoun I. And since I is the subject of that missing or invisible verb, it should be in the subjective case I. So the correct sentence would read, no one in my town knows as much about local history as I. If you made it me, it would almost be saying, no one in my town knows as much about local history as they know about me, which doesn't sound very plausible. So the most natural and logical interpretation of the meaning of the sentence would make I the correct pronoun here. Let's look at our next sentence. Who or whom is the architect who or whom designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London? Here we have the pronoun who and whom being used twice in the sentence. The first time it's being used as an interrogative pronoun to introduce the question. The second time it's being used as a relative pronoun to introduce the subordinate clause. In both cases, who turns out to be correct. And remember, our rule is to look for the verb that follows who or whom and decide where the subject of that verb appears. If who or whom is the subject, then who is correct. If who or whom is not the subject, then whom is correct. Let's start with the first who or whom. Who or whom is the architect? Where's the verb in that clause? Well, the verb is. And we're looking now for the subject of the verb is. Who or what is the subject of the verb? Well, the subject is who. Who is the architect? So who is the subject of the verb is, and therefore the subjective case who is correct. Now let's look at the relative clause introduced by the other who or whom pronoun. Who or whom designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London? What's the verb in that clause? Well, the verb is designed. And what's the subject of the verb designed? Who or what did the designing? Well, again, the pronoun who is actually the subject of the verb designed. Since who is the subject of the verb designed, it should be in the subjective case who. So the sentence would correctly read, who is the architect who designed St. Paul's Cathedral in London? Next example. When the tennis match was over, Alvin realized that winning the match had mattered more to his opponent than he or him. Again, we have an elliptical clause at the end of the sentence, beginning with than. And in order to know whether he or him is correct, we need to complete the clause and see what it's actually saying. When the tennis match was over, Alvin realized that winning the match had mattered more to his opponent than it had mattered to him. That's what the sentence is really saying, that his opponent cared more about winning the match than Alvin did. So winning the match had mattered more to his opponent than it had to him. Once we fill in the blanks and complete the meaning of the clause, we can see that the pronoun him is actually the object of the preposition. It's not the subject of the verb. Since it's the object of a preposition to him, then the objective case him would be correct. And so we fill in the missing words in the elliptical clause, we see what the meaning is, and that tells us whether the object or subjective case pronoun is correct. And in this case, him is the correct pronoun. Our next sentence gives us another who-whom question. Helen of Troy was the famous beauty over who or whom the Greeks and the Trojans fought. Here we have who and whom being used as a relative pronoun to introduce the subordinate clause. Now let's look at that clause. Who or whom the Greeks and the Trojans fought, or over whom the Greeks and the Trojans fought. Now within that subordinate clause, what's the verb? The verb is fought. Now let's look for the subject of the verb fought. Who did the fighting? The Greeks and the Trojans. They're the ones who did the fighting. They are the subject of fought. So what is the role of who-whom? Who-whom is the object of the preposition over. They fought over who or whom. Therefore, whom is not the subject of the verb, rather it's the object of the preposition over. And for that reason, the objective case, whom, is correct. We looked for the verb, and then we asked, is who or whom the subject of the verb? And the answer is no. The Greeks and the Trojans are the subject of the verb. Since who or whom is not the subject of the verb, instead it's the object of the preposition, and therefore whom is correct. So this sentence should read, Helen of Troy was the famous beauty over whom the Greeks and the Trojans fought. One more sentence. The two couples whom will be sharing the bungalow by the lake are the Savios and us or we. Once again, we have who or whom to contend with, and once again, who or whom is playing the role of a relative clause. Let's look at the clause. Who or whom will be sharing the bungalow by the lake? Now, we're looking for the verb in that clause. What's the verb? Well, the verb is will be sharing. Now, what's the subject of the verb will be sharing? Who or what is doing the sharing? Well, the answer is who. The pronoun who is the subject of the verb will be sharing, and therefore the subjective case who is correct. So the two couples who will be sharing the bungalow would be correct. Now what about the pronoun at the very end of the sentence, us versus we? Well, the two couples are the Savios and us or we. Well, we have a compound situation here. It's the Savios and us or we, which may complicate this a bit. But remember, what we really need to figure out is whether this is a subject or an object. Now, remember that when you have a verb of being, what follows may be a subject complement. And that's what we have in this case. The verb of being is the verb are. And the sentence as a whole is saying that the two couples, blah, 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 are the Savios and us or we. So the two couples, that's the subject of the independent clause. Are is the verb, and the Savios and us or we is the subject complement. That is, giving further information about the two couples who are mentioned way back at the beginning of the sentence. Since the Savios and us or we is the subject complement, we need to use the subjective case of the pronoun, just as we would if it weren't compound. In other words, if the Savios were out of the picture and if we were the only ones in the cabin or in the bungalow, we would treat this as a subject complement and therefore use the subjective case pronoun. So we, the subjective case, is correct. And the complete sentence should read, the two couples who will be sharing the bungalow by the lake are the Savios and we. That last pronoun is a little tricky because it's a compound situation, but again, just pretend it isn't a compound situation. Eliminate the other object, and you can clearly see that in this case it's a subject complement, and therefore the subjective case we is correct. If you found the topics in this particular program a little tricky, all I can say is it could be much worse. As you may know, in some other languages, every noun can take on a number of different forms depending on exactly how it's used in a sentence. And in English, centuries ago, that was also the case. Over the last few centuries, however, English has become greatly simplified, and now just a few words, such as the pronouns, take on these different forms, which we call cases, depending on how they're being used in the sentence. The vast majority of English nouns don't change their form at all, except to become plural or to become possessive. So it could be a lot worse. Please remember that next time you find yourself tripped up by something like an elliptical clause or the who-whom question. And remember that English, after all, isn't the most complicated subject in the world, even though at times it may feel that way. Remember that you can always go back and view portions of this program again if you need a brief refresher. I hope you did find this program helpful, and I'll look forward to speaking with you about other English topics on other programs in this series. Thanks for watching.